We'll move on to the next guest lecture by Professor Martin Leon. Professor Martin Leon is a legendary figure in cardiovascular medicine and interventional cardiology. We have been very grateful to him for starting and nurturing the relationship between his center and the Indian hospitals and our Indian colleagues. Thank you, sir, very much for that.
Thank you.
Now that is Dr. Martin Leon for you. He is going to speak to us on innovations in interventional cardiology, the 5 next big changes. Dr. Martin Leon.
Thank you very much. I realize that we're running a little bit late, so I'm going to try to go quickly. Originally, this was planned to be 30 minutes. Let's see if I can do it in a little bit more expeditiously. These were my disclosures. We're talking about innovation as the bedrock of interventional cardiology. First, you have to ask yourself, what is innovation? If you look at it literally, innovation is novelty that creates value. When we think about innovators, we think about an iconic lone genius in a laboratory like Thomas Edison or Steve Jobs. But in medicine, it's different. If we look at the evolution of MI care, this is back in the 1950s, how we treated patients with myocardial infarction. In fact, the President of the United States, who received only heparin, bed rest, and aspirin, and there's an 80% reduction in mortality associated with heart attacks. And by 2010, if you look at the changes that have resulted in that dramatic reduction, it's not one thing. It is a variety of drugs, devices, and systems that have been put in place that have resulted in a dramatic improvement in clinical care. So truly, medical innovation is progress in technology that is less the result of an individual genius and more from collective effort and social, political, and economic forces that come together to create an ecosystem which fosters innovation. So we have a heritage of subscribing to medical innovation. It started with Forsman, Soames, Dotter, and certainly Andreas Grunzig. And we've now celebrated more than 30 years of innovators, charismatic innovators that have affected the way we treat patients with cardiovascular disease. Generally, that heritage tells us that we believe that lesser invasive is better, that we are technology addicts. We are passionate about experimental and clinical research in evidence-based medicine. You've heard that in Ajay's last talk. We rely heavily on adjunctive imaging. It's a very visual subspecialty. We're passionate about the interface of clinical medicine and rapid communication of ideas, which is why we care about educational meetings. There's a vibrant entrepreneurial spirit. We strongly promote and support global and multidisciplinary collaborations. So we have acquired this identity of innovation, strong industry partnerships, and patience leading to evolution and forward motion. So we need to stimulate change and to continually reinvent ourselves. And in doing so, we always look forward to the future. I want to mention that we've had some recent losses, some very important innovators, Don Baim and Jeffrey Hartzler, over the past few years that have also left us that should be remembered as part of that tradition of people who've contributed to our subspecialty. Many people would argue that there is a crisis in innovation. We've written about it, talked about it over the past several years. It's a combination of socioeconomic factors, many things that affect innovation, and changing clinical imperatives. There's a depressed global economy. There's stagnant growth in traditional cardiovascular markets. Very cost-sensitive reimbursement everywhere. Contracted investment capital, declining patents, problematic regulatory environment, a lot of media and governmental scrutiny, and then things such as physician conflict of interest constraints. So many of these things have really affected us and have created what's been called the valley of death, which is the chasm between scientific discovery and the doctor's office. So generally, this is a typical landscape of how we develop new technology. What's happened is the regulatory process is protracted, revenue and sales go down, so there's more money, more time, more risk, innovation is stifled. Worldwide PCI procedures are not increasing at the rate that we've experienced over the past decade, but we are seeing a significant reduction in average sales price of things such as drug-eluting stents. In major innovative centers such as Silicon Valley, we see a reduction in most of the parameters that indicate that innovation is active, alive, and well. We see a reduction in patents, and we see changes in global leadership. Countries such as Israel, where the government supports innovation and there's an entrepreneurial spirit, now have become leaders in developing new technologies in medical devices and medical therapy strategies. There are divergent regulatory climates, more difficult to get devices approved in certain parts of the world. This is an example of drug-eluting stents in the US, a 5-year lag between the approval of the Endeavor Resolute in Europe and the US, and the cost of developing new technology has increased dramatically, from hundreds of thousands of dollars to balloons, to tens of millions of dollars for a bare metal stent, to $500 million to develop something like a new drug-eluting stent. And of course, media scrutiny has been overwhelming and has really impacted, in many ways, our ability to develop new devices. So this engine has to be restarted. We have to reinvigorate the system. So interventional cardiology has always been heavily dependent on these risk-taking creative spirits, this dedication to innovation, and an environment which fosters creativity and innovation. We've learned many lessons. You have to address a pertinent clinical need. Ideally, we should invade new large clinical markets that have unsatisfactory current therapies. We should recapitulate the non-surgical, less invasive catheter-based treatment dogma. This can be advanced technology, but it has to be simple to explain and easy to use. Platform technologies take too long to develop. You have to have clear regulatory approval pathways. Evidence-based clinical data is extremely important in 2012. We should have a global strategy from the outset, not just US or US and Europe. Now major markets such as China, India have become extremely important to innovation, and it must be cost-sensitive and respect problematic economic milieus during what's been a global economic crisis. So for PCI, with dramatic improvement in all the parameters of success, safety, effectiveness, it's difficult to achieve very much more positive results. So many of these therapies that are shown on this slide are not being actively pursued because the iterative opportunities for improvement are less. What we're seeing is marked expansion of the cardiovascular clinical markets, so that over the next decade we expect that half of the overall revenue associated with interventional cardiovascular medicine will not be vascular therapy, but other things. So let's now discuss what those 5 next big things are. But before we go to completely new things, I want to revisit the vascular arena, because there's no question that despite the successes we've had over the past 15 years, that vascular drug delivery is still in a state of constant change. We've talked before that drug-eluting stents are exciting, that first-generation devices have reduced restenosis importantly, but there were also pathobiologic changes that disturbed us. When we look at studies like the Syntax trial and complex lesions, from the standpoint of both safety and effectiveness, we were not as good as surgery in complex 3-vessel and complex 3-vessel plus left main disease, and there was a much higher frequency of stent thrombosis, particularly late stent thrombosis, which was cumulative and certainly problematic. 1.3% stent thrombosis per year in years 2 through 4 in the Syntax trial with the Taxus stent. And certainly in Horizons AMI, looking at the 3-year stent thrombosis rates, still much too high, close to 5% for both bare metal and drug-eluting stents. Surtax late, again showing significant late target lesion revascularization associated with drug-eluting stents. And when you do angiograms late, you see that there is not just late loss, but very late loss associated with drug-eluting stents, possibly associated with a new process, which is neoatherosclerosis within a drug-eluting stent, which has been demonstrated now in many different studies, pathology observations, in this case, some echo observations. So there's no question that we can improve the results with drug-eluting stents. One of the ways to improve drug-eluting stents is to change the platform. So clearly you need the stent initially as a vascular support. You need the drug to modulate vascular responses, and you need a carrier to elute a drug load and to control kinetic release. But there are 4 third-generation solutions to vascular drug delivery that are being actively pursued. Metallic stents with a small amount of absorbable polymer, metallic stents with no polymer, fully bioabsorbable vascular scaffolds, and drug-coated balloons. This is an example of a Biolamus A9 eluting stent, the first of the genre of bioabsorbable drug delivery with a small amount in a polymer that elutes a drug, Biolamus A9. The leader's trial, as Ajay showed, clearly demonstrated that there appeared to be some late safety benefit associated with decreased stent thrombosis after 1 year, possibly related to this new formulation with a bioabsorbable polymer. Another stent like this is the Boston Scientific Synergy stent, which has an abluminal coating bioabsorbable polymer. This will enter clinical trials in the next 6 months. The Freedom Stent is a drug-eluting stent that is polymer-free, where the drug is released from the surface. And the Create stent is similar, a polymer-free sirolimus-eluting, drug-eluting stent. This is an exaggerated version of that, the drug-filled stent by Medtronic, which has not entered clinical trials but is in animal studies, where the drug elution is controlled by diffusion, where the drug is actually loaded on the inside of the stent without any polymers. Again, a very novel concept that should improve the safety of drug-eluting stents. And here in India, a very creative company called Mera Life Sciences from Vapi has something called the Mitsu stent. This is the thinnest stent that's ever been developed. It's a 40-micron cobalt alloy stent with a new drug called Marilamis, and with a drug delivery platform, which is a very novel polymer-free formulation. So in India, I think you're seeing very creative, iterative designs that should improve the safety and effectiveness and deliverability of next-generation vascular scaffolds. Now, certainly many people believe that fully bioreabsorbable stents or scaffolds are going to be the future of many patients that require local vascular delivery with stents to treat obstructive coronary disease. We've seen early results from the Absorb trial. These are OCT results showing dramatic benefit at 24 months with positive remodeling, no adverse effects, very encouraging changes. We see new designs, which now are easier to handle and more like metallic stents, and we see preserved or normal vessel reactivity out to 2 years, suggesting that these vessels have been returned to a relatively normal state. There are and will be extensive randomized clinical trials to see if these bioabsorbable scaffolds have particular benefits from the standpoint of safety and effectiveness, not just at 1 year, but out through 5 years, comparing these versus standard metallic drug-eluting stents. So the future of DES, I think, is very strong. I think they're good, but they can certainly be much better. Adding to that, without the time to discuss it at length, drug-eluting balloons or drug-coated balloons may have some benefit in certain specific situations in the coronary tree, small vessels, branch vessel bifurcation disease, and potentially in-stent restenosis. So another additive new device, which I think will have some value in specific situations. The second area of new development is structural heart disease. Now, this is a wastebasket term that applies to many different interventions that don't involve the vascular tree. There's tremendous excitement because these are new patient care treatment alternatives for common diseases like hypertension. It's completely additive to what we do in the cath lab. It crosses subspecialty territorial boundaries, which is exciting for us. It requires new training and educational initiatives. It has tremendous economic market potential. Transcatheter aortic valve replacement has arrived. Over 50,000 patients treated through the end of last year in over 500 centers. Tremendous growth in Europe. In the United States, early approval several months ago with expanded indications, we think, in the next several months. We've had already 4 manuscripts in the New England Journal of Medicine over an 18-month period to describe the effects of this new therapy in patients with high-risk aortic stenosis. This is the 500th case we did at Columbia with Sushil Kodali and Matt Williams, who are the two co-directors of the New York Presbyterian Columbia Heart Valve Center, where we do as many as 8 to 10 of these procedures per week. The expectation is a compound annual growth rate of 40% per year, which is dramatic. This has not yet affected India, but it will affect India certainly in the next several years. Today we only have a few stent designs, but I can tell you that tomorrow, and I'll discuss this later, there are many new interesting stent designs that should improve the safety of transcatheter AVR. The mitral valve is not being spared. There have been interesting studies now for many years looking at a modulating technique, the mitral clip technique, to affect an edge-to-edge repair of the mitral valve, and an initial pivotal clinical trial called Everest-2, which made its safety and effectiveness endpoints. This device is approved and being used. Over 5,000 patients treated in the past 2 years in Europe, and also in the United States. They'll be going to panel in the next several months with new randomized trials being planned. There are many other active mitral valve devices on the landscape, as shown here, that affect the annulus, the coronary sinus, even new mitral valve replacement techniques that are beginning first human use studies. The next major structural target is going to be the left atrial appendage. Certainly it's problematic to treat patients with atrial fibrillation with chronic systemic anticoagulation for long periods of time, especially high-risk patients. So an alternative in these patients could certainly be important in reducing stroke risk and reducing bleeding complications. This is the early version of the Watchman LAA closure filter system. The primary efficacy has been demonstrated in an initial clinical trial, and many more studies being done with results expected in the next several months, which should validate the use of this important new therapy. A third area that you've read about, heard about, which is now in the midst of important clinical trials, is treating refractory hypertension, which occurs in about 1/3 of patients that have systemic hypertension who are treated but have uncontrolled hypertension. We've learned that the kidney is a recipient of sympathetic signals via the renal efferent nerves that affect renin release, sodium retention, and renal blood flow. We've also learned that the kidney is the origin of central sympathetic drive via the renal afferent nerves, and this affects many things, including LV hypertrophy, sleep disturbances, insulin resistance, could affect many different syndromes. You can ablate the sympathetic nerves by using techniques such as radiofrequency thermal ablation with catheters placed inside of renal arteries. A series of studies have been done systematically over the past 5 years. Simplicity 1, initially simply a first human use, non-randomized observational study with 24-month follow-up demonstrating dramatic reductions in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Simplicity 2, a small randomized trial looking at renal denervation versus control in 24 centers, again showing dramatic similar reductions in systolic and diastolic blood pressure in refractory hypertensives with a response rate of between 85 and 90%. And now we're in the midst of Simplicity 3, an important clinical trial, a 2-to-1 randomization in the United States, 530 patients with a sham control to see if we can importantly affect systemic hypertension in these refractory patients using renal denervation. These renal nerves are in the adventitia around the renal arteries, in the first several centimeters of the renal arteries. We've been focusing on radiofrequency ablation with catheters. Balloons can do it as well, but intravascular radiation, local drug delivery with things like alcohol or neurotoxins, cryotherapy, and high-frequency ultrasound are also being used. There are more than 20 devices that are being studied right now to affect changes in the renal sympathetic nerves that could have an important effect on hypertension. And again, the predictions are that if this is successful, this will have a dramatic impact on a very common disease, hypertension. The fourth major field I'd like to discuss is interventional heart failure. I think this potentially could be the largest area that we treat over the next decade. New targets include sensors to monitor therapy, things like the so-called CardioMEMS device or Savicor, LV remodeling techniques with devices such as cardiokinetics to affect left ventricular aneurysms, contractility modulation with devices such as impulse dynamics. Transcatheter mitral valve therapies can affect heart failure. Stem cell therapies as well. Renal denervation is now being studied in an early pilot study in patients with heart failure. Advanced cardiac support devices such as LVADs, ECMO, and microVADs, and then other syndromes like patients that have heart failure with preserved ejection fraction being treated in early studies with interatrial shunts. This is an example of the CardioMEMS device, a sensor for heart failure in a CHAMPION trial that was reported 2 years ago. It's a randomized trial showing a 30% reduction in hospitalizations by simply monitoring PA pressures using a device like this. There are interesting ways to affect support in patients with late class 3 and class 4 heart failure, which are very common. Rather than a destination LVAD in the end-stage patient, partial support with a microVAD may be an effective alternative. This is a device which is about the same size as a battery, which is now being implanted in series between the left atrium and the subclavian artery as a pump. It is a microVAD, and this is going to be taken into randomized clinical trials. It's now actively being studied in Europe. It's an example of a device which ultimately can be implanted percutaneously, which can have an important effect on heart failure, a device-based therapy. And finally, you're going to see miscellaneous out-of-box concepts, things that you hadn't thought about, where interventional devices can have an important impact on how we manage patients. So chronic cerebrospinal venous insufficiency, or so-called CCSVI, has been associated with multiple sclerosis. There are multiple significant venous stenoses involving the jugular veins and the azygos vein in patients with multiple sclerosis. This has been demonstrated first by Zamboni, but now many other colleagues. And it's also been demonstrated in observational studies that if you do jugular vein angioplasty or azygos vein angioplasty, that in many instances there can be important clinical improvement. So this needs to be studied in a much more systematic way, but can be an important therapy for patients with multiple sclerosis. We don't know if it's real, but I think we'll have answers in the next few years. I've talked before that erectile dysfunction is an epidemic. 25 million men in the US and more than 300 million men worldwide. It is largely vasculogenic, 80% of the time. And it's well identified that the pudendal artery, which arises from the internal iliac artery, is generally the source. There are other causes of ED, but vasculogenic causes are the most common. And simply either dilating or stenting the pudendal artery can have an effect on erectile dysfunction. An initial study has been completed in the United States. It's a prospective single-arm trial in 30 patients that had no major adverse effects, where a zodorolmus-eluting, basically coronary stent, was implanted in patients with obstructive pudendal artery disease and erectile dysfunction, with an almost 70% improvement in erectile dysfunction at 3 months. So what I've quickly try to suggest to you is that this is a new world that we're facing. That innovation in interventional cardiology is ubiquitous. Over more than 3 decades, this field has evolved in stages, challenging conventional wisdom and overcoming biologic obstacles. Innovation combined with a commitment to rigorous scientific principles and a dedicated global collaboration has resulted in what's been a vibrant medical subspecialty. You saw this creative case of doing alcohol septal ablation of a conal artery in somebody with infundibular stenosis, an interesting application of many of the things we've learned. But we are in the midst of challenging times. We're at the crossroads. There's a reemergence of medical therapy being discussed, bypass surgery with studies like Courage and Syntax, Freedom coming up, coupled with financial pressures that threaten to limit future vascular interventional growth. So now's the time, I think, to rediscover past success by extending the interventional model to other unmet cardiovascular disease states, as I've suggested, things like structural heart disease, the breakthrough emergence of TAVR, and possibly renal denervation therapy for hypertension, if ongoing studies continue to demonstrate significant benefit, are the first steps as interventional cardiology enters this new phase of striking diversity and creativity. The interventional community must respond by embracing change and providing the milieu for future growth. So I would simply summarize by saying there's never been a better time to be an interventional cardiologist. But for us to succeed in the future, we need to change our thinking, and we must adapt and evolve to respond to some of these new therapies and new disease states that provide tremendous opportunity for taking the interventional model and treating patients with a variety of other common diseases that otherwise have been either incompletely or only partially successfully treated in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Martin Leon, for such a wonderful journey which has taken us to the future. We must accept that the present day circumstances, including the economic slowdown, are challenging us, and he has made us a roadmap of how to accept the challenge and overcome it. Pan-cardiology, pan-vascular thoughts, and intriguing solutions. So I think he deserves a very big hand for such a wonderful lecture.